The Boston wind felt like a serrated blade against my neck. I stood outside the Simmons mansion, my fingers numbly gripping the hand of my 7-year-old daughter. My wife drained $250,000 from our joint savings to save her parents. On Christmas night, she and her family threw me out like trash. I thought I had lost everything. I was wrong. Then a billionaire stepped in. The iron gates groaned shut behind us, a final metallic verdict. Inside, the warm LED lights mocked my shivering skin. The silence of the suburbs was deafening. Katie looked up at me, her eyes red from the sudden, cold violence of her grandfather's slap. I had worked 12-hour shifts at the docks for 10 years to build that savings account. Every cent was a drop of sweat or a missed dinner with my girl. Rachel had looked through me like I was made of glass. She stood by the fireplace, sipping expensive wine while her father pointed to the door. Her jewelry glittered like cold, unblinking eyes. I led Katie to my rattling old truck. The engine coughed twice before turning over, sounding as exhausted as my spirit. I pulled up the banking app on my phone, hoping for a glitch. The screen showed a flat $0 balance. That money was meant for Katie's future and a house of our own. It was gone, fed into the gaping maw of Simmons Logistics. I checked the apartment keys on my ring. They felt light and useless. I knew then the locks would already be changed. We drove through the festive streets of South Boston. Every glowing window felt like an insult to our homelessness. I pulled into a gas station to buy Katie a hot chocolate with my last $20 bill. The clerk watched us with tired curiosity. I caught my reflection in the plexiglass. My face was bruised and my dock jacket was caked in salt. I was a ghost in my own city. Behind me, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled into the lot. It didn't belong in this neighborhood. I sat on the tailgate of the truck, watching Katie sleep in the passenger seat. The cold was beginning to settle deep into my bones. My phone vibrated with a text from Rachel. She told me not to come back for my things. She claimed the court would see me as an unstable vagrant. My chest tightened until breathing became a chore. I realized the divorce was a trap they had planned for months. Then, the black sedan's door opened. A man in a tailored suit stepped out. The man walked toward me with a steady, commanding grace. He didn't look like a threat, but he radiated a heavy, quiet power. He stopped 3 feet away, ignoring the grime of the gas station. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly groomed. I clenched my fists, ready for another Simmons-funded lawyer. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at my bruised face and my rattling truck. He pulled a silver case from his pocket. He held out a card that caught the fluorescent light. "I saw what happened at the mansion," he said quietly. His voice was like deep thunder, calm and resonant. He introduced himself as Alexander Ward. I recognized the name from the headlines of the financial papers. He was the man the Simmons family had spent months trying to court. They wanted his investment to cover their hidden debts. He looked at the mansion's gate code, written on a scrap of paper in my hand. He knew their secrets. He looked at me and didn't see a dock worker. He told me his contract with the Simmons family was still unsigned. He had been looking for a reason to walk away from their toxic legacy. He needed someone who knew the real truth of their shipping manifests. I realized he was offering me a weapon, not just a job. My father-in-law had made a mistake by leaving me alive and angry. I looked at the card and then at my sleeping daughter. The wind was still cold, but the internal fire was finally starting to burn. Alexander Ward's card felt heavy in my frozen hand. The silver foil caught the flickering fluorescent light of the gas station. He watched me with the stillness of a predator. I looked back at the truck where Katie slept. My face throbbed where Douglas had struck me. Ward didn't offer a handshake or empty platitudes. He leaned against his sedan and checked a gold watch. The silent power he radiated made the Simmons mansion look like a plastic dollhouse. He knew I was desperate. "You have 10 minutes to decide," Ward said. His voice was a calm, low resonance that cut through the wind. I stared at the zero balance on my phone screen. Rachel had taken everything I earned. My father-in-law had bruised my soul and my skin. I thought of the shipping manifests I handled at the docks. I knew the Simmons family was skimming from the union pensions. I had the keys to their destruction in my head. I looked at Ward and nodded. We drove to a quiet diner on the edge of the city. The smell of burnt coffee and grease filled the air. Ward sat in a corner booth. his eyes scanning the room. He pulled a thick folder from a leather case. It contained the logistics contract the Simmons family was begging him to sign. I saw the inflated numbers and the forged signatures on the back pages. My hands shook as I realized the scale of their fraud. They were drowning in debt. They used your savings to pay off a bribe. Ward whispered. He tapped a finger on a bank transfer receipt. My stomach turned as I recognized the exact amount. $250,000. Rachel hadn't saved the company for her parents. She had covered up a criminal investigation. My sacrifice was nothing more than a band-aid for their sins. I looked at the ceiling and exhaled. The betrayal was deeper than I ever imagined. My wife was a thief. Ward offered me a temporary room in a secure building. I carried Katie inside, her small body still heavy with sleep. The suit was cold and modern. It felt like a bunker for a war I hadn't expected to fight. I sat by the window and watched the street for black sedans. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from my mother in Maine. Her voice was thin and shaky. My father had collapsed near the old fishing docks back home in Maine. The world was shrinking again. I told Ward I had to leave for Portland. He didn't blink or argue. He handed me a stack of cash for the drive. I drove through the night, the highway a blur of gray salt. The truck felt like it might fall apart at any moment. I reached the hospital as the sun began to rise. My mother stood by the intake desk, her face ashen. The doctors were talking about a double bypass. The cost was a mountain I couldn't climb. The hospital administrator looked at me with pity. She held a clipboard with the estimated surgical costs. I had nothing left to sell. My truck was a rust bucket and my bank was empty. I thought of Rachel's smirking face in the courtroom. She had stripped me of my dignity just when I needed it most. I leaned against the cold white wall and closed my eyes. Then the administrator's phone rang. She listened for a moment and looked up at me. "The bill has been settled," she said quietly. I stood frozen in the hallway. A private foundation had wired the full amount for my father's care. I knew it was Ward. He was moving pieces on a board I couldn't see yet. It turned out Ward Global Holdings had cleared the entire balance. My father was wheeled toward the operating room. I gripped his hand for 1 second before the doors closed. He looked small under the blue sheets. I felt a cold, sharp resolve take root in my chest. I sat in the waiting room and called Ward. I thanked him for the miracle. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted the names of the dock foremen who took the Simmons kickbacks. I gave him every detail I remembered from the night shifts. I told him about the ghost containers in the South Yard. We talked until the hospital lights flickered with the morning surge. I was no longer a victim. I was an asset. Then I saw Douglas Simmons on the news. The hospital television flickered with Douglas Simmons' smug face. He was announcing a new maritime partnership, standing tall in a silk suit that cost more than my father's life. My blood surged as he praised family values for the cameras. He looked invincible. I sat on a plastic chair, clutching a cold cup of coffee, while the news anchor gushed over the stock price. The injustice felt like a physical weight on my chest. I knew the truth behind his polished smile. His empire was a hollow shell. I stepped into the hallway to call Ward back. I told him about the ghost containers sitting in the South Yard. Those units were packed with unregistered electronics and luxury cars. It was the heart of the Simmons kickback scheme. Ward stayed silent for a beat, his breathing steady through the phone line. I could hear the scratching of a pen on paper. He was building the coffin for my father, in-law's career. I gave him the codes for the high-security padlock. It was the ultimate betrayal. A nurse tapped my shoulder, her expression unreadable behind a blue mask. She led me to a private consultation room with no windows. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I expected bad news about my father's heart. Instead, a man in a gray trench coat was waiting for me. He held a legal envelope stamped with the Simmons Logistics logo. He was a process server, his eyes tired and indifferent. He didn't care about the hospital setting. He just wanted a signature. "You've been served," the man muttered. He slid the heavy envelope across the table. I tore it open, my hands shaking with suppressed rage. It was a restraining order preventing me from contacting Rachel or Katie. They were using the police to keep me away from my own daughter. The document claimed I was a threat to their safety and corporate stability. I looked at the legal jargon and felt the world tilt. My wife was trying to erase me from our daughter's life. I walked back to my father's bedside, feeling completely hollow. He was awake, his skin pale but his eyes clear. He gripped my hand with surprising strength. He saw the legal papers and shook his head slowly. He had spent his life on the docks, surviving storms and strikes. He told me to keep my head down and my eyes open. He whispered that the truth always surfaces when the tide goes out. I felt a surge of guilt for his suffering. My war was killing him. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. It was a local detective from the Boston precinct. He told me there was a report of a stolen vehicle in my name. Rachel had reported my old truck as a theft to harass me further. I realized they weren't going to stop until I was behind bars. Every move I made was being watched by their private security. I looked at the truck keys in my pocket. They were useless now. I was trapped in Portland. I called Ward and told him about the police report. He didn't sound surprised at all. He said the Simmons family always overplays their hand when they feel a threat. He told me to stay in the hospital until his car arrived for me. He was sending a professional driver to fetch me and Katie. I felt like a chess piece being moved by a master. The hospital hallway felt narrower as I waited. I kept my daughter close to the bed. Everything was shifting. The driver arrived 2 hours later, looking like a stone statue. He wore a dark suit and carried a secure briefcase. He didn't speak as he escorted us to the parking lot. I saw a black SUV waiting with the engine idling. We climbed into the leather interior, the doors closing with a heavy thud. I looked back at the hospital, wondering if I would ever see my father again. The driver handed me a new phone. It had one contact saved in the memory. Ward's voice came through the speakers as we pulled away. He told me the authorities were already at the South Yard. Federal agents were cutting the locks on the ghost containers at that very moment. The Simmons logistics licenses were being suspended effective immediately. I felt a cold rush of victory, but it was fleeting. Ward warned me that Rachel had disappeared with her lawyers that morning. She wasn't at the mansion or the office. My daughter and I were still in danger. The SUV glided toward a hidden estate outside the city. Rain lashed the reinforced glass while Katie slept beside me. Ward's new phone felt heavy in my palm. The betrayal of the restraining order burned in my chest like hot coal. Rachel was hiding behind high-priced attorneys and missing signatures. I needed to find her before the Simmons family burned every bridge. The driver turned onto a gravel path lined with ancient oaks. A sprawling glass house emerged from the gray mist. It looked like a fortress for a king. Ward stood in the grand foyer, his silhouette framed by a massive chandelier. He held a crystal glass filled with amber liquid. He watched me enter with a clinical gaze. There was no pity in his expression. He gestured toward a wall of monitors displaying real-time news feeds. The South Yard was a sea of blue and red police cruiser lights. Agents were hauling crates from the ghost containers I had identified. My father-in-law's face was frozen in a digital crawl. His world was finally catching fire. "The federal raid is just the beginning," Ward said. He tapped a screen showing Rachel's luxury car parked near a private airfield. My heart skipped a beat as I saw her moving luggage. She wasn't just hiding. She was planning to flee the country with Katie's passport. My hands clenched into tight fists until my knuckles turned white. She was willing to abandon her dying father to save her own skin. I looked at Ward for a solution. He simply slid a gold key across the table. The key belonged to a safe in the Simmons corporate office. Ward explained that Douglas kept a second set of books in a hidden floor panel. These logs proved Rachel had authorized the theft of our joint savings herself. It wasn't just a family bailout, it was a personal embezzlement scheme. I felt a cold surge of realization. My wife hadn't just used me. She had targeted me as a fall guy. I stood up and straightened my dock jacket. It was time to go back. The drive back to Boston felt like an eternity. We bypassed the main gates and entered through a service tunnel. The office building was eerily silent and dark. Most employees had fled when the news of the federal raid broke. I used the gold key to enter Douglas's private suite. The smell of expensive tobacco and panic hung thick in the air. I found the floor panel behind a heavy oak desk. The logs were right where Ward had promised. They were filled with Rachel's distinctive, elegant cursive. I heard the sound of a heavy door clicking shut. I spun around to see Douglas Simmons standing in the shadows. He looked broken, his silk tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. He held a small, black handgun with a trembling hand. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like a cornered animal ready to bite. He accused me of destroying his legacy for a paycheck. I held the ledger up so he could see the proof. He didn't care about the truth. "You were never one of us?" Douglas hissed. He stepped closer, the barrel of the gun shaking. I saw the desperation of a man who had lost everything but his pride. I told him the feds were already outside the building. His daughter had already abandoned him at the airfield. He paused, his expression shifting from rage to sheer confusion. He didn't know Rachel was leaving him behind. The realization hit him harder than any slap. He lowered the weapon slightly. It was the only opening I needed. I wrestled the gun from his weak grip. We tumbled across the plush carpet as the sirens grew louder downstairs. I pinned him down, breathing hard against the stench of his expensive cologne. He stopped fighting and began to sob like a child. I stood up and gathered the ledgers into my bag. My face throbbed where he had hit me on Christmas. I felt no joy in seeing him broken on the floor. I only felt a deep, hollow relief. The police burst through the doors. I walked past the officers and into the cold night air. Ward was waiting by the curb in a dark sedan. He took the ledgers and nodded with a grim approval. He told me the airfield had been locked down 10 minutes ago. Rachel was in custody, but Katie was currently with social services. My heart plummeted at the news. I had the proof of Rachel's crimes, but my daughter was still out of reach. A black car pulled up behind us. A woman I didn't recognize stepped out. The woman was tall, wearing a charcoal wool coat. She held a leather portfolio like a shield. Ward introduced her as Sarah, the most aggressive family attorney in the state. My heart hammered as I thought of Katie sitting in a cold government office. Sarah didn't offer a smile. She simply checked her watch and told me we had exactly 2 hours. If we didn't move now, the Simmons family would use their remaining influence to bury the custody file. We climbed into the sedan, leaving the sirens behind. The social services building was a bleak concrete box. Fluorescent lights flickered over rows of plastic chairs and peeling gray paint. I saw Katie sitting at a small table, her head bowed over a coloring book. She looked so small against the shadows of the room. My throat tightened with a raw, desperate ache. A social worker stood by the door, blocking my path with a clipboard. She told me I lacked the proper clearance to take her. The Simmons restraining order was still active. Sarah stepped forward and opened the ledger I had recovered. She showed the social worker the documents proving Rachel's embezzlement. The legal air in the room shifted instantly. Sarah explained that the petitioner was currently under federal arrest for fraud and flight. The social worker's eyes widened as she scanned the elegant cursive entries. The ledger was a confession written in ink. The power of the Simmons name was evaporating in the heat of the truth. I finally saw a flicker of hope. "You need a judge to vacate the order," the worker said. She looked at Katie, then back at the legal files. Sarah pulled out a burner phone and made a single call. I realized then that Ward's reach extended into the judicial chambers. We waited in the hallway, the silence heavy and thick. I watched Katie through the glass, praying she wouldn't look up and see my fear. A fax machine began to hum in the corner office. It was the emergency court order. We left the building as the first light of dawn broke. Katie clung to my neck, her small hands shaking. I felt the wetness of her tears on my shoulder. We drove toward Ward's estate, bypassing the morning traffic. The city felt different now, less like a cage. Ward was waiting in the garden, his face unreadable in the mist. He told me the feds had finished the audit. The Simmons family was officially bankrupt. Every asset was being seized by the state. Ward led us into a quiet library filled with old books. He told me I couldn't go back to the docks. The union was tied to the Simmons kickback scheme. He offered me a position in his new logistics division. I would be the lead investigator for his internal audits. I looked at my hands caked in salt and stained with ink. I wasn't just a worker anymore. I was the man who knew where the bodies were buried. I accepted without a moment of hesitation. 6 months later, I stood in the new Ward Global headquarters. I wore a tailored suit that fit my broad shoulders. My office overlooked the harbor where I used to haul nets. The view was clear and bright. I spent my days hunting the kind of corporate rot that destroyed lives. I was good at it because I knew the smell of it. My father had recovered and was fishing again in Maine. Life was stable, quiet, and real. Then my assistant buzzed the intercom. "A woman is here to see you," she said. I walked to the reception area and saw Rachel. She looked hollow, her designer clothes replaced by a cheap, stained jacket. She was staying in a shelter on the edge of town. She begged me for a loan to pay her legal fees. She claimed her parents were starving in their rented apartment. I looked at her and felt no anger. The fire had burned out long ago. I saw the ghost of a stranger. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $1 bill. I laid it on the polished counter between us. I told her it was all I owed her for the memories. It was the only currency I would ever give her again. She looked at the bill and began to sob. I turned my back and walked toward the elevators. Katie was waiting for me at home with her homework. I had a dinner to cook and a life to lead. As the doors closed, I saw Rachel's father on the news. He was crying. Ward gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. He looked tired but victorious. He opened the file and slid a single photograph across the mahogany surface. It showed a warehouse on the outskirts of Chelsea I didn't recognize. Ward explained that this was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a private storage unit registered in Rachel's name. It contained the physical ledger of the union pension funds. The feds were missing this one critical link. Without it, the Simmons family might avoid the most serious criminal charges. The obstacle was the location's security. Rachel had changed the biometric codes after our meeting in the lobby. She knew the walls were closing in on her family. I realized she hadn't come to beg for a loan just out of desperation. She was testing my resolve to see if I was still soft. I felt a surge of cold fury at the realization. My daughter was sleeping safely at home, but her mother was still playing dangerous games. I stood up and straightened my tie. I had to get those keys. Ward handed me a small electronic device. It was a signal interceptor designed to bypass the Chelsea unit's older locking mechanism. I drove through the midnight streets of Boston, the engine of the luxury car a low purr. The Chelsea district was dark and smelled of salt and rotting wood. I found the warehouse at the end of a dead-end street. The biometric scanner glowed red in the damp air. My heart hammered as I pressed the device against the cold metal. It chirped once and the heavy door groaned open. The air inside the unit was stagnant and smelled of dust. I moved my flashlight over stacks of crates and old furniture. I found the safe hidden behind a pile of moth-eaten rugs. It wasn't a digital safe, but an old iron box with a physical dial. I remembered the numbers Rachel used for everything. I tried our wedding anniversary, and the dial clicked into place. The door swung open to reveal the missing pension ledger. I reached for the book, but a sudden noise stopped my hand cold. The warehouse floorboards creaked behind me. I spun around to see Eric Simmons standing in the doorway. He looked disheveled, holding a jagged piece of rebar like a weapon. He had followed me from the office. His eyes were wide and bloodshot from a long night of drinking. He told me that ledger was the only thing keeping his father out of a federal cell. He didn't want the truth. He wanted leverage to save his skin. He stepped into the light, swinging the heavy metal rod. I dodged the first blow, the rebar whistling past my ear. Eric was clumsy, fueled by a frantic, blind panic. I grabbed his wrist and twisted until he cried out. We tumbled into a stack of old Simmons memorabilia. I saw a framed photo of our wedding day shatter under his weight. It was a fitting end for a marriage built on lies. I pinned him against the wall and looked at the man I once called brother. He was nothing but a shadow of a ghost. I took the rod away. I realized Eric wasn't alone. A dark car was idling outside the open warehouse door. Rachel had managed to post bail using hidden assets, appearing as a shadow of her former self, and now she stepped out, her face illuminated by the car's headlights. She wasn't sobbing anymore. Her expression was hard and calculated. She held a phone and told me she was recording the entire encounter. She claimed she would report me for assault if I didn't hand over the ledger. This was her final move to reclaim her power. She thought I was still the same man she could easily bully. I held the ledger up so she could see it clearly. I told her the feds already had digital copies of every other document. This book was just the physical proof they needed for the final indictment. Rachel's hard expression crumbled as she realized she had no cards left to play. She looked at Eric, who was slumped on the floor, and then back at me. I walked past her toward my car, the ledger tucked firmly under my arm. She didn't try to stop me, she just watched me leave. The drive back to the city felt longer than the trip out. I delivered the ledger to the waiting federal agents in the lobby of the federal building. They took the book with gloved hands and nodded in a silent, professional greeting. The Simmons case was now airtight and ready for trial. I took the elevator back up to see Ward. He was standing by the window, watching the sunrise over the Atlantic. He told me the mission was over. The Simmons name would be scrubbed from the city's records by noon tomorrow. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my side where Eric had struck me. I sat on the sofa. Ward poured 2 glasses of water and sat beside me. He told me I had done more than just save a company. I had protected the city from a family of leeches. He offered me a week of paid leave to spend with Katie. I realized I finally had the one thing the Simmons could never buy. I had earned my peace through the fire. I closed my eyes. The morning light began to fill the executive suite. I thought about the docks and the cold nights hauling nets. That life felt like a dream belonging to another person. I was a man who had faced the elite and emerged stronger. My daughter would never have to worry about the cost of a surgery. She would never have to fear the slap of a Simmons. I was the architect of a new legacy. I stood up and shook Ward's hand. It was a firm, honest grip of a true partner. I walked out of the building and into the crisp morning air. The city was waking up, unaware of the quiet war that had ended. I drove home to find Katie playing in the backyard. She ran to me and hugged my legs with all her might. I lifted her up and felt the warmth of her laughter. I looked at the small house I had built and smiled. Then I saw a man in a black suit waiting by my gate. He wasn't a Simmons lawyer. He looked like an agent. The man in the black suit didn't flinch as I approached the gate. He held a leather wallet open to reveal a federal badge. My heartbeat spiked against my ribs like a trapped bird. I thought the nightmare had finally concluded with the ledger. He told me that my presence was required at a secure location immediately. It wasn't about the Simmons family's debts or their fraud. This was about a threat that had bypassed the state police. He glanced at Katie, his eyes showing a flicker of genuine concern. The war was expanding. I settled Katie with my neighbor before climbing into the black car. The interior smelled of sterile plastic and cold coffee. The agent didn't speak as we wove through the morning traffic toward the federal building. I looked at my bruised knuckles and felt the phantom H in my side. Eric's attack had been desperate, but this felt calculated. We entered a basement garage where Ward was already waiting. He stood near a bank of humming servers, his face pale in the blue light. He held a decrypted tablet. It was bad news. Ward explained that the Simmons family wasn't the only player in the logistics scheme. They were merely a front for a larger offshore conglomerate. This group had been monitoring the federal investigation for weeks. They viewed my cooperation as a liability that needed to be liquidated. I realized then that my victory was a target on my back. The billionaire's hand shook slightly as he scrolled through a list of intercepted messages. They knew where my father was fishing in Maine. They knew Katie's school schedule. The room felt suddenly like an airtight tomb. The agent stepped forward and laid a satellite map on the table. He pointed to a small inlet north of Portland. It was a secluded spot where my father docked his boat. A suspicious vessel had been spotted idling in the area since dawn. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline wash over me. I had to reach him before the tide came in. Ward offered his private helicopter sitting on the roof. We didn't have time for a scenic drive. I had to make an irreversible decision to leave the city. The helicopter blades roared, cutting through the damp Boston air. I watched the skyscrapers shrink into toy blocks. Below us, the Atlantic was a churning mass of dark gray water. I gripped the seatbelt until the webbing bit into my palms. Ward sat across from me, shouting over the engine noise. He told me his security team was already moving toward the school. Katie was being relocated to a safe house. I closed my eyes and prayed for my father's safety. The flight to Maine felt like a journey through eternity. We landed in a clearing near the coastal woods. The scent of pine and salt hit me like a physical memory. I ran toward the docks, my boots thumping on the damp earth. The agent followed, his weapon drawn and his eyes scanning the tree line. I saw my father's boat, the Sea Star, bobbing gently in the water. Everything looked peaceful, but the silence was wrong. There were no gulls crying and no wind in the rigging. I reached the pier and saw a single, black glove lying on the wooden planks. A floorboard creaked behind a stack of lobster crates. I spun around as a man stepped into the light. He wasn't a Simmons henchman or a dock worker. He was a professional, wearing a tactical vest and a neutral expression. He held a suppressed pistol aimed at my chest. He didn't want the ledger or the money. He wanted to send a message to Alexander Ward. I realized I was just a pawn in a game of global shadow banking. He pulled the trigger. The sound was a soft, metallic puff. I dove behind a heavy iron winch as the bullet sparked off the metal. The federal agent returned fire, the loud cracks echoing across the bay. I crawled through the salt spray, looking for a weapon. I found a heavy gaff hook leaning against a pylon. My father's life depended on my ability to distract this ghost. I saw a movement in the cabin of the boat. My father was tied to the pilot's chair, his mouth taped shut. I felt a surge of ancient, primal rage. I wasn't a manager now. I swung the gaff hook with everything I had left. It caught the man's shoulder, pulling him off balance. He tumbled toward the edge of the pier. The federal agent finished the job with a single, precise shot. The professional disappeared into the dark water with a muffled splash. I scrambled onto the boat and cut my father's zip ties. He gasped for air, his face red and his hands trembling. He looked at me with a mixture of terror and pride. We were safe, but the cost was rising. Ward's voice crackled through the agent's radio. He told us the offshore group had been identified and their accounts were being frozen. This was the mid-scene turn I hadn't expected. Ward hadn't just been protecting me. He was using me as bait to trigger a global seizure. I felt a flash of betrayal at being used so coldly. I looked at the billionaire who had saved my father's life. He had traded my safety for a market victory. I stood up on the deck and stared at the sky. I made the irreversible decision to quit Ward Global on the spot. I told the agent to tell Ward that the debt was paid in full. I didn't want to be a piece on his board anymore. I wanted the quiet life I had promised Katie. My father gripped my arm, sensing the shift in my soul. We watched the helicopter depart, leaving us in the sudden silence of the Maine coast. The city felt like a distant, poisonous dream. I was finally a free man. The ride back to Portland was quiet and slow. My father drove his old truck, his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't ask about the gunfights or the billionaires. He just talked about the weather and the upcoming season. We picked up Katie from the safe house that evening. She didn't know about the danger. She thought it was a secret adventure. I held her close and smelled the scent of her hair. The Simmons family was in prison. Ward was richer. I had my family back. We sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the ocean. The colors were vibrant, bleeding into the dark water. I realized my worth wasn't tied to a suit or a ledger. It was tied to the man who stood his ground. I looked at the dark horizon and saw a single light flashing. It was a signal from a boat I didn't recognize. My heart skipped a beat as the pattern repeated. It was a code I had learned at the docks years ago. The past wasn't quite done with me. The flashing light on the horizon blinked in a sequence I knew by heart. It was a dock worker's signal for a shifting tide. I stood on the main porch, watching the rhythm of the dark water. I realized the lie I had lived for years was finally dead. My value was never a dollar sign or a corporate title. It was the grit in my hands and the safety of my girl. I reached for my father's binoculars. A small skiff was approaching the pier. The skiff bumped against the wood with a hollow thud. I expected another ghost, but a single man stepped out. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped under a heavy canvas coat. He wasn't an assassin or a lawyer. He was a foreman I had worked with back in Boston. He held a weathered envelope sealed with wax. He told me the union had revolted against the Simmons cronies. The union had pressured the bank to reverse the fraudulent transfers from the Shell account, reclaiming the funds stolen from our family. I opened the envelope and found a cashier's check for $250,000. The numbers looked surreal against the backdrop of the Atlantic. This was the ghost of my past life returning to offer a choice. I could take it and disappear, or I could use it to fix the docks. My father watched me from the doorway, his eyes weighing my soul. He didn't say a word, he just pointed to the fire. I felt the heat on my face. The mid-scene turn came when the foreman whispered a secret. Rachel hadn't been arrested. She had turned state's witness to save her mother. She was walking free in exchange for testifying against her father. The realization that she was still playing the victim made my blood turn to ice. She would come for Katie once the heat died down. I looked at the check and then at the skiff. The power balance shifted. I didn't need the money. I needed a permanent wall. I handed the check back to the foreman. I told him to distribute it among the families whose pensions Douglas had stolen. My worth was now defined by what I could give away. I saw the shock in his eyes, but he nodded with deep respect. He promised the union would keep a permanent watch on the main roads. I was no longer a lone worker. I was a brother. I felt the lie of my insignificance finally dissolve into the salt air. The sun began to rise over the jagged Maine coastline. The light was pale and honest. Katie came out and sat on my lap, her hair smelling of sleep. I told her we were staying here forever. We would build a life where no one measured a person by their bank account. She smiled and pointed at a gull circling the pier. The billionaire and the socialites were a world away. I was just a man with a daughter and a future. I looked at the burner phone Ward had given me. It was silent and cold. I walked to the edge of the pier and tossed it into the deep. The water swallowed it without a sound. I didn't want the billionaire's shadow over my home any longer. I had paid my debts with blood and truth. The past was a sinking stone in the dark. I turned back toward the house, my father waiting with a fresh pot of black coffee. A black sedan appeared at the top of the coastal road. My heart skipped a beat before I saw the logo on the door. It wasn't the feds or the Simmons lawyers. It was a local delivery driver bringing supplies for the winter. I exhaled, the tension finally leaving my shoulders for good. I walked inside and closed the door against the morning chill. Everything was quiet. Then, the landline phone in the kitchen began to ring with an unknown local 7-digit number.